That the trend of globalization is at the root of the current financial crisis. They argue that poorer nations are essentially at the mercy of those represented at the G20 summit. But for more on this, I'm joined by Neil Watkins, who heads an alliance of 75 religious groups, development agencies, and human rights organizations advocating for the poor. I'm also joined by Korok Ray, a business professor at Georgetown University, who also worked briefly on the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House under President George Bush. Welcome to you both. Neil Watkins, did the G20 summit put the plight of the poor nations firmly on the agenda?
Well, I think the G20 did take important steps by announcing that they were going to provide significant sums to help the developing world deal with the crisis. The problem is that the institution they chose to deliver those funds through, the IMF, has a record of that's quite poor for the past 20 years in its impacts in poor countries.
Korok Ray, many people would agree with this statement. G20 now turning to the IMF to prevent a crisis that many people would blame many of its policies and all the strings attached with some of its lending policies to the poor countries of this world as being part of the problem. It's now the savior?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that the structure of the system is the most important feature of the financial economy, and it's, instead of trying to separate cleanly the rich from the poor, I think what we live in a really interconnected world, and what we really want is to make sure that financial institutions and the financial structures work well. I think giving more money to the IMF for the purposes of surveillance and research, I think that's fine, but trying to think of a supranational regulator that makes laws for all countries that has excessive power may be a mistake.
I think part of the problem is that there's actually a double standard. The IMF is telling poor countries that they need to cut spending, that they need to raise interest rates. They're telling poor countries to do exactly the opposite of what we're actually doing in the United States and some of the rich countries. So that this double standard occurs, and I think the IMF continues to push what we would consider market fundamentalist sort of policies, you know, that the free market is the solution to everything. When in reality, this crisis shows that there are some real questions about whether the free market is really helping the poor.
Were any of these questions answered, Korok Ray? Because we heard many people at the G20 summit talk about the need to tweak and reform the international financial system. They're pouring money into the IMF and other financial institutions, but no one really was talking about giving up on the very system of capitalism and free trade that many people say got us into this.
Well, let's take a step back and let's remember that, look, the surest way out of poverty is economic growth. And the best way to get around economic growth is to have a stable financial sector, to have investments in human and physical capital, to have free trade of movement of both capital and labor. These are the fundamentals of our world. And yes, there's been a slight shift towards maybe less of a free market, but I think the system as a whole is sound, and we need to focus exclusively on a few pieces of the puzzle with financial regulation. And the G20 announcement will do that. But my view is that, look, markets by their very nature, they fluctuate. Economies grow and shrink. That's part of a fact of life.
But the reality is the impacts of the market system we have means that countries in Africa or Latin America or Asia are thrust into great turmoil when something goes wrong on Wall Street. So you have a crisis right now which really originated in excess sort of deregulation, in a free market excess. And now who's paying for that? Some of the poorest people in the world. You're going to have 53 million people fall into poverty this year. So I think though the G20 started to look at regulation and putting their hands around this casino capitalism, that they should go further, that we need to see tougher measures taken, and that we need to see more movement towards sort of economic stimulus packages that can help countries recover from the crisis.
Are these countries likely to have a bigger say? We heard Gordon Brown talk about a global New Deal, which would suggest that both sets of countries would join forces together. I mean, is that likely to happen?
Well, I think coordination of economic policies is always a good thing. What I worry about is too much power in the hands of a single institution. And the problem is that if, say, the IMF has that power and they make a mistake and all the countries are following that standard, then sort of the whole system gets messed up.
Are we seeing any hints of the beginning of a new world economic order, do you think, Neil Watkins?
Well, I mean, one thing you can say about this G20 summit is that it is more ambitious in some ways than the G8 has been for the past 5 or 10 years, where you have sort of the same old things repackaged every year. They took a little bit further step, but I think they fell far short of even what President of France asked for last November when the G20 first met, which was a remaking of the global economic system. I think they fell short of that, but at least they took some initial steps, and I think there's a lot of movement still to go to correct what has become sort of a free market model that has gone awry in the world.
But still, we didn't hear anything about the prospect of a new global trade deal that would also improve the prospects of poorer countries, did we?
Well, I don't think that trade is sort of front and center on the agenda. I think this is really a financial crisis. Let's keep our eye on the ball. Macroeconomic stimulus is important, but really this is about banks and how banks operate and how they're regulated. There was a lot of different pieces of the puzzle that were, I think, a little distracting. The trade was, in my view, a little distracting, as was the sideshow with regulating hedge funds. I mean, hedge funds are everyone's favorite scapegoat, but they really were not central to the buildup of the crisis, and the action should be about looking at the banking sectors.
Well, you've got to get a handle on some of these hedge funds. I mean, they're secretive. They operate completely without regulation, without even knowing who's on the board of these things. I mean, these are huge actors in the economy, and I think the steps that we're taking today were just initial steps, and I think we need to see even more. One other thing I would say that's an important issue is that one of the problems with the response is that it suggests that there may be a new debt crisis building for the developing world, in the sense that the whole package today was provided in the form of loans, and countries are going to take on a lot more loans. We think the G20 should have provided some grants or even debt relief in addition to the new loans for the developing world.
I think so. First, on the hedge funds, look, let's look at the facts. The facts are that the most regulated financial institutions in the U.S. are banks. Banks were where the problems were. The hedge funds were fine. And also, let's think about the benefits of all this lending, which is a lot of capital was made available to the poor countries over the last decade. There'll be a little bit of a contraction now, but still, there are many benefits.
Neil Watkins and Korok Ray, thanks very much for this. Thanks for joining us. And let's take another short break, but still to come here on Al Jazeera. On trial for murder and abuse of power, we look at the history of Peru's former